Welcome to another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. I am your host, Dr. Teresa J. Canada. In this podcast, I continue to focus on discussions around public school segregation, integration, housing, busing, and related issues in the North. This episode will focus on the city of Rochester, New York. Rochester is the city where I spent nearly 10 years of my life as I completed my undergraduate degree and later returned to complete my doctoral degree. So instead of a guest who participated in school integration or desegregation efforts in Rochester, I had someone who researched and wrote about the history of the Rochester situation. So it's with great pleasure I welcome today's guest, Mr. Justin Murphy, educational journalist and author of the book titled Your Children Are Very Greatly in Danger, School Segregation in Rochester, New York. Welcome, Mr. Murphy.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well today. Thank you so much for participating in this particular podcast. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So, the first thing I'm going to ask, and so that you can share with the audience your background and what prompted you to write about the Rochester, New York school segregation situation.
Sure. So my day job is I'm an education reporter at the Democrat and Chronicle. That's the main metro newspaper here in Rochester. And I've been doing this for about 11 years. And I grew up in the Rochester area, but not in the Rochester City School District. I grew up in one of the suburbs, relatively well-off suburb to the east of the city. And so as I began my career reporting mostly on the city school district, and here as elsewhere, that mostly involves criticizing all the stuff they're doing wrong and all their shortcomings. I could kind of compare that, of course, to my own education and my own upbringing in a very different setting. And I wrote about all of the things that people propose as reasons why the RCSD, the Rochester City School District, is failing in various ways. School board meddlesome, teachers are not working hard enough, the superintendent is pulling all the wrong levers, the charter schools, the union. And ultimately, I felt like that was all insufficient to explain the problem for two main reasons. The first one is that the situation in the Rochester metro area is not unlike the situation in pretty much every single other metro area in the country. There's one place where the mostly brown and black, mostly poorer kids go to school, and next to it, a place where the wealthier, whiter kids go to school, and that wealthier, whiter district does better on whatever metric you choose in general. So that can't be strictly a Rochester problem. And the second thing is that the disparities we see in education by race and by class are the same as the disparities we see in the criminal justice system and healthcare and access to jobs and housing. Mm-hmm. So those two kind of gradual realizations made me feel like there's got to be something more that explains not just the Rochester School District, but kind of like this broader pattern that we see everywhere in the country in every context. And of course, that pattern, in a word, is racism. And so with my focus on my local setting, that kind of led me into researching what happened in Rochester. How did we get to this situation where we are with the boundaries meaning what they mean, and the extremely different educational context that kids in Rochester grew up with compared to what I grew up with in an adjacent school district. And just to kind of really drive this home, 3 or 4 years ago, a study came out where they took every 2 adjacent school districts in the entire country, any 2 districts right next to each other, and measured I think it was the level of childhood poverty in each of them, and to see where the steepest gradients were. And in the entire country of any two school districts next to each other anywhere, the steepest gradient was between Rochester and Penfield, which is where I went to school.
Wow, that's interesting.
Penfield was like, I want to say maybe 5 or 6% kids living in poverty. And in the city of Rochester, it's maybe like 52%.
Yes,
So that's the, like, if you take one step across the district line anywhere in the country, that's the biggest step you can take.
that's interesting. So you found out through your research.
Yeah.
Um, Now, as I mentioned, this particular podcast talks about issues related to the North because there are many people, I mean, there are many students, even present day students, who are completely unaware that schools were segregated in the North. They only see stories about the South. So I thought that, based upon my book, I talked about the New York City public schools in particular and experiences that took place during the New York City public school desegregation efforts. So just speaking to some students, they're completely unaware of the fact that there were discrepancies in the North. They only know the stories about the South. So I use this podcast as a way to give people an idea of what did take place. And I think you talked about it in your book about what started out, and then also whether or not the Brown decision made a difference at all in the Rochester City School and the efforts that were made. So can you describe some of the examples of efforts that were made or attempted in Rochester?
Yeah. So, as you know, it took a while, right? Like right after Brown, obviously the immediate impact was in the South, where these districts were just absolutely like wide open to judicial intervention because they clearly had been in violation of that. When you look back at the newspaper coverage in 1954 in Rochester and places like Rochester, it's, they're agreeing. They're like, this is great. Segregation is wrong. Like, this is the correct thing. And I hope that those, backwards folks in Alabama will see the light. And it takes 5 or 6 years before the waves kind of reach the shores of Lake Ontario up here. And they say, well, wait a second. That's not what we meant when we said desegregate the schools. We were talking about you all, not us. And so that's kind of an interesting moment, I think, because by the 60s, when New York City and Rochester and Chicago and Buffalo and these northern cities are grappling with this, there's already like a pattern um, of lawsuits and kind of case law around how Brown's going to be applied. And the pushback is growing so fast that it's kind of almost like, I think of it as a race against time of like whether we can put any meaningful change into place before the political moment passes. And we don't want to talk about this anymore. So in Rochester, that comes to a head in the 1971-72 school year. The year before that, the pro-integration school board got elected and finally, after many years of discussion, put in a desegregation plan. It's a pretty modest one, but it involves redrawing secondary school boundaries to, just divide the kids up differently. And it was enormously disruptive and disrupted. There was a very well organized pushback by white parents who didn't want to be a part of that. There was actually about 500 or 600 kids who got pulled out of the Rochester City School District and put into what they called block schools, which were like essentially uncredited tutoring centers that kids
In
would
the city of Rochester.
in the city of Rochester. So another word for those would be like a segregation academy, like you see
Yes,
in the South.
that's what it sounds like.
It is what it sounds like. They go there for tutoring from like retired teachers for 2 or 3 hours a day, and they had their kids there the entire year. There are an enormous amount of violence, mostly perpetuated by white parents or community members, not by the kids themselves. And in the middle of it, there's a new school board election. They elect a new majority that is opposed to desegregation, and they overturn it. And this new board overturns it, and there's an immediate sort of concern, like, oh well, surely the judges will strike that down. I mean, like at this point, there's a question of how far Brown reaches, but
Right.
surely you can't put in a desegregation plan and then say, oops, never mind, we don't want to do that. But that is, in fact,
That,
exactly what happened.
that
And
sounds
for
like the intentions, huh?
that was the intention. And for various reasons, judicial caution and whatever else, the lawsuit opposing it failed and the whole thing fell apart. And, Milliken versus Bradley comes 2 years later, and that's all she wrote.
Okay. Can you tell us what is a little about the Milton Bradley case?
Sure. So Milliken is, um, that comes out of Detroit, and um, there's a federal desegregation lawsuit in Detroit. It gets to a judge, and he finds, yes, the Detroit schools are segregated.
Right.
And the obligation under Brown at that time is, when you find segregated schools, you need to desegregate them. You need to find a plan to desegregate them, and that can't include transportation or anything else, but you got to get the job done.
Right.
He observes that so many white people have left Detroit for the suburbs that there's no way to chop it up anymore to get desegregated schools. And so he does the only thing he sees that he can, which is draw a plan involving all of the suburban districts as well. They, of course, sue and say, hold on, like, this isn't our fight, leave us out of it. It gets to the Supreme Court. Um, so the question is, when you've got, on one hand, under Brown, an affirmative obligation to desegregate, and on the other hand, these municipal boundaries, which in other cases are inviolable, what has to give? Now, as you know, Richard Nixon had gotten a chance to appoint 4 Supreme Court justices by that time, and one of his explicit litmus tests for them was, you must be against busing for integration. So the time comes, his guys hold the line, and they say, you cannot involve any other districts unless you can specifically prove that they had a hand. And so that, combined with another ruling a few years earlier having to do with funding levels, that pretty much seals the deal for northern cities like Rochester. You can't desegregate them, and you can't move money around to really help things either.
Okay. But let's, I want to just address this issue. When you talked about how they tried to do this in Rochester, it was meant to, like, chopping up the different schools. And you're saying they had especially, like, segregated schools for the Black children, Black brown children. Did this start just on secondary, or did it include elementary and middle school or junior high school at that time?
In that one year, 71, 72, it was just secondary. Now it was part of I think a 3-year plan, and they were going to get to the rest of it if they had managed to come to year 2 and year 3. But what they basically did was, if you have over here on the east side, an all Black school, and over here on the, adjacent on the west side, an all white school, you draw a new attendance boundary, and you have half of the kids in that entire area go to 7 through 9 grade 7 through 9 in one school, 10 through 12 in another. So
Okay.
theoretically, you've taken 2 segregated schools and created 2 desegregated schools.
Okay. That was the process. That was basically the intent.
Yeah.
Okay. I was curious because what's interesting, and based upon the other school situations, most of them started like high school, you know, and I think the impetus was they wanted to stay away from the early grades because of young children. Did you find that to be an issue also from your research?
Yeah, I think that was certainly part of the thinking, was that maybe they thought it would be kind of more inflammatory if you start with, the 5 and the 6-year-olds. But there had been earlier kind of tentative steps to do that with the younger kids. There was one moment in Rochester where there was a Black school that was so overcrowded, an elementary school, and an adjacent white school had like 5 or 6 empty classrooms because people were leaving for the suburbs. So finally, after years of talking about it, they agreed to let some of those black kids go to the white school. These are elementary school kids. But
Right.
when they did it, they took two intact classrooms and put them in and transported them to the white school. So there were black classrooms in their own wing of the building in the white school that
Okay.
didn't talk with the other kids.
So they didn't have any interaction at all with the other students in the school.
Correct. And they
The
said,
intention.
well, they said it's not racially discriminatory. We divided them up by ability level is what they said.
So therefore, obviously, they don't have the same ability level as the students who are currently in the school. So we had to make
Obvious.
sure that they had to stay in that same separate group because their ability level was different from those who actually were the original students in the school.
Correct.
Okay. So now I'll say that it's interesting because when I talk about the situation that I experienced when I was going to the elementary school, when I left my neighborhood and go to the other school that I attended, they wanted to make sure the students who did come were able to maintain the standards of the academic acclimate of the school. And so, in essence, they selected the students to come in,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? So that was very interesting. And the fact is, most of what you just mentioned about the rooms that were empty, 5 classrooms that were empty. Well, we talk about this integration or a desegregation process, but as I found in my research and my experience, is that the school that, well, quote unquote, allowed the Black and brown children to come into their school, they not only wanted to select them, they also wanted to make sure that they did not ruin the reputation, and they also needed students.
Hmm.
Okay, so it was about enrollment issues,
That's right.
right?
Absolutely.
And so I don't think that people understood this. And one of the things that just came out recently, which I'll have to do more research on, is about the fact that they accepted students, but none of the teachers.
Mhm.
So there was never a teacher who actually moved with the children in any of these circumstances, from what I understand. Did that happen in the Rochester school? Did you find any teachers who were welcome to join these other administrations at these other schools?
That's a little bit of a tricky question because at that time in Rochester, there were still so few black teachers. Like even the all black schools were almost entirely staffed by white teachers.
Okay. Okay.
Um, so and they didn't, unlike in the South, they didn't close those black schools down. So, but to answer your question, I think no, they didn't pay any particular attention to that. And in fact, what often happened was, when they divided up the secondary schools and some became senior high schools and some became junior high schools, a lot of the teachers didn't really want to go to the junior high schools because that's usually a more chaotic situation.
Yes. Yes.
So it ended up being all of the brand new, teachers lacking seniority at those schools, which didn't help when they end up going haywire.
Yeah, that's interesting. And let me just also note that from my understanding of Rochester City Schools, they were, in order to be able to get more black teachers to come to Rochester, they did a really initial outreach to HBCUs in the South.
Yeah, that's
And many of the Black teachers who did come to Rochester were students who attended some of the Southern schools, HBC schools. And let me just, for my audience, understand HBC schools, historically Black colleges and universities, who were part of a teaching rush to the North. Um, and that really was a big issue. Otherwise, I don't know if Rochester, and not just Rochester, some other school districts in the North as well, but I know specifically in Rochester because I knew some of those people who were teachers in Rochester who came from HBCUs who were in the system for several years when I first arrived in Rochester. So I know that that was an issue. That's how they were able to get more Black teachers to come to the city of Rochester.
yeah. And I think, that's an interesting moment because a black teacher coming from a Southern university in 1970 obviously has attended mostly segregated schools themselves, and that's their kind of frame of reference. And so I talked to a few of those teachers, and they described that as being extremely disorienting, not just to go from south to north, not just to go from mostly black kids to black and white kids together, but to go from this expectation of when you're a teacher in a southern black school, you're the you're the boss.
That's
Like,
right.
that's
That's right.
it.
That's
And
right.
it's not necessarily like that when you come up here.
That's that's a very interesting point you're making about the perception, because if anyone who does research about the Southern schools, teachers were premier. The teachers were premier in the South, and they were like the parent of the child. They whatever the teacher instructed, that they would even visit. They would call the parents. They would talk to their homes. They would visit. All that was pretty acceptable in the South, but it was not part of the strategy or the foray in the North. And I think that was an adjustment also for many of the Black teachers who came to Rochester that period of time. So
Yeah.
what about administrators?
There were a couple. So actually, this is interesting. The very first Black principal in Rochester was in, I want to say 1963, or was it 62? And her appointment was announced on the very same day that Rochester, for the first time, was hit with a federal desegregation lawsuit.
Wow.
And so they were able to kind of like engineer what the front page looked like. Like, on one hand, we're being sued, but look, we have a
Yep.
Black principal now.
And I think I know who that person is. I think I met her. But anyway, I'm just saying,
Yes. Yeah.
wow.
Her name's Alice Young. She's
Yes.
still alive. She's a
Yes.
wonderful woman. And in fact, 2 or 3 years ago, she had a school named after her.
Yes.
One of our schools have been named after Nathaniel Rochester, the founder of the city, who owned many people in slavery. And it was renamed the Alice Holloway Young Academy of Excellence or something. Very
Right.
well
Right.
deserved.
Yeah. Is it in, let's see, it's across the street from Rochester. It's on, oh,
It's,
wait,
yeah, it's in the third ward, which is the
right.
historical Black community.
Right. That's what I thought. That's what I thought. Yeah. So I'm just saying here, but I'm thinking that was a turning point in a sense, because they had never had a Black principal. Okay. And how to handle that and what that meant. Were there some from meeting with her or talking to her, were there some instances that she gave you where she experienced some kinds of discriminatory practices, or what was was a carpet rolled out for her? What was the overall experience?
I think that she and others always felt like they had to be perfect. They had to do better than any other principal could do. Um, this isn't really about race, but there was one funny moment where she was saying in the 60s, all the teachers were wearing, the female teachers and everybody were wearing dresses. And she looked down, she was on the second story, and she looked down, and there was a construction crew looking up at, at the women under their dresses. And so she gave them permission to wear pants, and she wore pants, and she got hauled down to the superintendent's office saying, well, hold on a second. What's going on here? That's not what women teachers wear. And she said, in my school, it
So
is.
that's what's going to happen in my
You know,
school. That's a really interesting story. I've never heard that one. That's a really good one. Um, wow. So she noticed that. So she was attentive and observant. Well, then do you think that when there was an onslaught of Black teachers coming in, they were all pretty much placed in the Black schools, correct?
uh, I wouldn't say all, but disproportionately, certainly.
Okay. Okay, but with all within in the city of Rochester. So now let's segue a little bit. You're being from Penfield. I know, like around the port and Britt Brighton, all those other areas. Talk a little bit about the surrounding area schools and what was happening in those schools during some of this time.
Yeah. So not a lot. Certainly in terms of, certainly not in terms of teacher diversity. Actually, I spoke with a longtime educator around here who started as a student teacher in the suburbs. She's Puerto Rican. And she told me that when she got there, as a young student teacher in a suburban district, one of her students asked her if she had a knife on her because his dad had told him that Puerto Ricans always carry knives. Some of this stuff would be funny if it wasn't
Right,
so.
right, exactly. But that's unfortunate, because you know what? I hate to say this, that some of that still exists today.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and that's which is unfortunate, but that's still. And I'm saying, I want to ask this question: do you believe that it would make a difference that young people earlier instead of later, have ability to get to know other people in schools, because that's probably the main meeting ground, would make a difference in our society as a whole.
Oh, of course, yeah. My so I live in the city of Rochester, and my daughter just started. She was in kindergarten last year at a wonderful elementary school. It's near our house, and about half of the kids are refugees from all over the world. And so, like, she'll come home and be like, "Oh, it's Eid today," or like, pretty much anytime we're listening to the news in some countries on there, something happened in Afghanistan. She'll, "Oh, my friend mom is from Mexico. She was telling me this morning about her friend, or from Afghanistan. My friend, she's telling me this morning about her friend from Mexico. She said, is it hot in Mexico? I said, yeah, it's pretty hot there. She said, oh, well, my one friend from Mexico, he always says it's cold. And even when everybody else is hot, he wears his coat because he says that it's too cold in Rochester. So yeah, I mean, there's no question. We all know that from research and from our
Yes.
own personal experience that those stereotypes just fall away when, oh, I know a person, I know a Puerto Rican, they don't always have a knife. Like, that's my teacher. What are you talking about? I mean, I think both immediately and an extremely long time, So like for a kid, it doesn't take long to accept that there are all different kinds of people from all different places, and they're all, the same at heart. But that's a very different thing from saying that we get to that point as a society where we can all tolerate each other at the least. You know, you you asked earlier about what was happening in the suburbs, and the main thing that was happening then and also now is we've got a voluntary transfer program where kids can go from Rochester to the suburbs. Um,
That's the urban
and
suburban program.
the urban suburban program, and that's been in place for about 55 years now.
Yeah.
And it's advocates will say, that's thousands and thousands and thousands of instances where two kids of different backgrounds met when they otherwise wouldn't have. And they became friends and they played on the team together and whatever else. And that's certainly true. There's no question about that. It's also the case that Rochester's program is the only one of that sort in the country where the suburban districts get to hand select the city kids that they choose, like
So
the
that's
MBA,
so
like the
that sounds
MBA
like what
grad.
I went through when I was a child.
Yes, they also get to send them back. They also don't have to
Oh,
take your
really?
siblings. Yes, really. And so there have been lawsuits where, for instance, a kid gets to the suburban district and then it turns out they need special ed. And the district says to the parents, you can stay or you can get special ed in the city, but you can't do both here. And, speaking of like what you said earlier, it reminded me of Derek Bell's theory of interest convergence. Recently, schools have realized that they make money on those kids because they get the state funding that follows a city kid and they bring them to the suburbs. So they make 10,000 bucks a pop when they
For a
take them.
child.
So they say, I've got a classroom that has 3 empty seats. I can fill those with hand selected, high performing kids who increase my diversity numbers, who don't cost me any extra money. And in fact, make me more money. And if I judged wrong and they get in fights or they get pregnant or they don't do well or whatever, it's fine. I'll just send them back and I'll get some other ones that do better. And that's our flagship shining example of a diversity program.
But what's the analogy there? What does that remind people of? The history in this country about people who may have been enslaved peoples.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they bring the resources and they use them up, and then they don't need them and they get rid of them.
Yeah. And
That,
they can always point and say, they'll say like, well, it's a great program because the urban suburban students have like a 98% graduation rate.
it's true.
It's like, yeah, but probably the Rochester City School District could have used those 800 very high performing kids instead of, and it would have been helpful to them if you would have taken one of those kids that needs a ton of services and a one-to-one aid and is not going to graduate and make you
Right.
look great, but still needs to be educated by somebody.
Right. I think what you described is pretty typical of many of the situations that started. Like I said before, my experience and knowing that the schools, they wanted the best. They wanted the ones who high academic achievement. They wanted students who had stable households. There's a lot of different criteria that came into play. Um, and maybe some specific ones, I guess, depending upon what this particular school offered. Because I understand from my experience, the ones that students that they all had to play an instrument um, and so forth and so on, either the band or the orchestra. And so they wanted to make sure that people maintained certain standards of the school that you were going to. But the interesting thing, there was no reverse. It was never like, for example, my question to you, did the suburban students go to the city schools?
So there was a time when they did, yes. And they, of course, so after Millikan, if you want to integrate in any way, you need to think of a different way to do it. And generally what that meant was magnet schools. You
Yes.
make a school that's so
Right.
great that everybody's going to want to go to it, and you put it in maybe a poorer part of the city, and then the whiter, wealthier kids will also want to go there, and now you'll have a nice integrated school. So there were a number of schools like that, and there still are those schools that suburban kids would like to go to, or white kids in the city would like to go to. But it ends up being the case that, if that school has 100 seats available, and there's a bunch of suburban kids that want to attend, but also like 500 kids in Rochester applied, at some point the district realized, like, well, that's not really fair to the students that we're serving to give those seats to kids in other districts, just to kind of make ourselves feel better about having integrated. So there
Okay.
was a period of that, and it doesn't really happen anymore.
Okay, so that discontinued. Okay, an attempt.
Yeah.
Okay. So that didn't fly. I mean, I do know someone whose son went through the urban suburban school process, so I was familiar with that. Um,
They've tried it again. So recently they did an interesting thing. For a while, RCSD had free pre-K, and a lot of the suburbs did not yet have it. And so they did a pilot program where there's one suburban school that's like, I don't know, maybe 500 feet over the line, and there's a city school right next to it. And the city school had pre-K and the other one didn't. And so they allowed some of the suburban parents to send their kids to the pre-K. So I wrote a story. It's, great. Kids are getting along. Everybody's playing. Everybody's saying all the right things.
right.
And I asked the suburban parents, like, oh, are you, because they're just telling me how much they love this school and the teachers and everybody. Are you thinking of keeping your children here for kindergarten maybe? Oh, no, 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 no. That's not what we're talking about. This is just for pre-K. Like, what do you mean why would I keep my kids here?
So it was intentional for just one specific. Uh, it's like they needed it for that purpose, and
Right.
that was.
I have a specific need that you
Right.
can fill for me, and then bye.
But is that not like many parents though?
Of course. Yeah, of course. And it's exacerbated when we have systems like we do, where people, like, are literally segregated, and everybody is kind of left to fight for their own interests in the place of a common good education system that serves all kids.
Well, let me ask this question. And I spoke about this at some point. When they say, "Oh, it's an integrated classroom," um, I said, "Oh, really? Yeah. Oh, yeah. We have." I said, "Well, what if it were just the opposite? If they're saying, for example, they have 20 children in a classroom and they have um, 16 students who are identified as white students, then you have two children who are Black and two children who are Puerto Rican. Oh, it's an integrated classroom, right? Would the same hold true if it were just the opposite? Would that be considered integrated classroom?" That's the question I say to people. Would that be considered integrated? What are your thoughts about that? And what you think parents, and as a parent, what would you think, how you think parents would react to that?
There's some interesting research, and maybe you've seen it, but some there was like a survey, I guess, of white parents asking, like, here's a classroom breakdown. Would you like your kid in this class, in this class, in this class? And they were trying to find the exact tipping point of just what you're saying. When is diverse too diverse?
Right.
It was around for white parents, it was around, I want to say, if I recall correctly, like 20% white kids was like too low, or like that was it. And then for black parents, it was much higher. Like if you're in a much greater minority, that's fine. But yeah, I think that that's absolutely true. And not only, some of that is pure bias and um, discrimination, but I think also some of it is that we all have been conditioned to understand that in our society, which is born from racism and genocide, when there's an institution that's mostly white and white controlled and an institution that's mostly black and black controlled, usually the white one gets better stuff, right?
Mhm.
Usually stuff come kind of tilts down toward them.
Mhm.
So when you see a classroom that mostly has black kids, then you might think like, oh, well, when we need state funding, this might not be the place that gets it. It might go to that other one that has 17 white kids instead of 17 non-white kids. And that
Yeah.
again, that's true, but like that's not helpful to all of us that we're making those calculations in our head instead of all being together as a thing.
Well, if you go back to the Brown decision, uh, Dr. Kenneth Clark, B. Clark, who was a psychologist, the late psychologist, and his wife Mamie, um, he did a famous doll experiment, and one of the issues that was discussed was it really about um, what you just explained. They felt that if you have black children in classrooms where white children are, then they're more likely to have the better equipment, then the resources will be there. Okay. So that in a sense gives an idea of was it about, it's not about just sitting next to a white child in a classroom.
Right. Right.
It's about the resources. All right. As we know from the Southern, discussions about the Southern schools and so forth and so on, how all the black schools, segregated black schools, received the leftover, the hand-me-down that of marked across, page missing books and so forth, if books at all. And there wasn't even a sufficient number of books. So I'm asking, do you think that that is something we have to be concerned about even now?
Yeah, for sure. Do you mean the resource discrepancy or just
Yes.
the yeah. Well, so yes, certainly. And I'll give, I think, what was a really compelling recent example that I reported on. RCSD's high school have pools, and RCSD has a swimming team. It's a district wide swimming team. And it is uh, majority white kids. I want to say mostly white kids, but there are some black kids. And this, and the pools at RCSD were not good enough for them to swim competitively. Either some of them were too small, and then other ones like the filtration system kept breaking or whatever.
Mhm.
And so these white parents who happens to be very well connected parents, they worked in the district or they knew people or whatever, they made a big stink about it and said, this is ridiculous. We can't have one swimming team in the whole district. And so it was in the news and they were at school board meetings and they fixed the pools. And as a result, not only did those privileged white kids and their parents get what they wanted, but also all the other kids, mostly black and brown kids at those schools, then had a functioning pool that they could swim in for gym class or whatever.
Right.
So
Right.
like that's a clear example of, yes, those parents have an interest. Yes, they're fighting for it, but it doesn't have to be a zero sum game across racial lines.
But that tends to be what happens, right? It tends
Yeah.
what happens. If not, so I think it goes back to the initial issue with that equal, the resources, the equity that that's lacking in schools, in a sense that, well, for example, one of the young ladies who I interviewed for my book said, why couldn't we have these same resources in our schools that we live, where we live, as opposed to the ones that we live, we go to these schools now. So that was a key question. It was resources, and why do you have to go outside your neighborhood? As most children, especially elementary, if the school's is closest to you. Um, so, why do we have to travel so far to go to get what we could have gotten in our own neighborhood? Those are discussions that came up. This was back in the mid to late 60s. So is that discussion that's taking place even now in 2023?
Yeah, it certainly is. And I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this. My perspective is, I mean, obviously the short answer is yes, there should be resources equally and equitably, even though that's the opposite of what Brown said. Brown said it's not about the resources. Um, but like I think now about, I was just presenting to the city school district cabinet, I don't know, 12, 15 people who are
Like,
making decisions. And they asked that question about resources. And I asked them in a class of 20 kids in RCSD, how many on a given day are experiencing some trauma or some distress that is making it difficult for them to learn? And they said, I don't know, probably 16 out of 20 versus maybe two or three in the adjacent adjoining suburban district. And
okay,
so, if we think about that in terms of resources, the first thing we usually think about is, well, those kids need social workers and guidance counselors and whatnot.
exactly.
So if we say we need to add 10 social workers to every school, and we have 50 schools. So now we need to hire 500 well-trained, culturally competent social workers. First of all, they don't exist. They don't want to
Right.
work in Rochester. We can't afford them. But even if we could, even if we did that and we have an army of social workers in all of our schools helping these kids get through, is that what that means? Is that an equitable education? I don't think it is. And
No.
then they go out into the world and fine, they've had the resources in their school, but now that kid from that all black and brown school is competing against the kid from the all white school to get into college, to get a
Yeah.
bank loan, to
Yeah.
buy a house, to get a job.
It
At
filters
some
down.
point, we just got to live together. It's at
Right.
some point we got to get in it together.
Yeah. Yeah. But the question is, when is that going to occur? That's the question. So I want to segue, because I know our time is running out here. In your book, you make 3 recommendations that may assist with moving Rochester and the surrounding suburbs forward. Okay.
Yeah.
And what are recommendations that you list in your book as the 3 steps toward change? Can you say to the audience what those 3 steps are?
Sure. So I'll go kind of briefly over the first two because those are sort of Rochester specific. The first one is that um, essentially what I'm calling for is a study to get background facts of how we could collaborate on education across district lines. And I think the really important thing about that's maybe a more general point, is that ineffective political segregation is that even if the superintendent in the white school district has the biggest heart in the world and wants to be part of the solution, he doesn't have any jurisdiction. He doesn't have any particular place to interact with the segregated school district, and he doesn't have the political base. He gets appointed or reelected by people in his own district, and so you need to have some place to get together to have a conference table where you can have those decisions. So my first recommendation is kind of getting at developing that. The second one is regarding urban suburban, as we mentioned, just some very basic uh, guidelines to at the least get it in line with the other programs in the country where it's a lottery, not a draft, and you can't kick them out.
Right.
Yeah, doesn't seem like it's asking much, but so far it is. But the third point I think is really the most important one, and that's just anti-racist education, because school segregation in the one little city of Rochester, New York, is just our local manifestation of the actual problem, which is just racism. It's just straight racism. And, I think Brown is a good example of Brown versus Board. It was an extremely powerful decision and precedent. And many well-intentioned people spent their careers trying to make it work in different districts, but they didn't because they underestimated the pushback from white families. And,
Okay.
and so I think the lesson is that you can't legislate your way around racism in America. At some point, we need to look at it head on. It needs to be a hearts and minds thing. And part of that is getting kids together in the same classroom. Part of that is, even if fine, you're in your all white school, you're still going to learn about some of this stuff, you know, and all we can do is hope that at some point our descendants will do a better job at it than we have up until now.
Great point. Okay. I'm hoping that the audience will take this in consideration when they hear these words from someone like you, who's done the research, who's experienced it, who has had a different viewpoint or had exposure to situations, having lived in a suburban area, having children now in Rochester area. And I think that it's important that people hear views from people who they don't expect they're going to hear some views from. I think that's what's so poignant about your book and about your reporting. And I'm very pleased to have you share that information with the audience today. So are there any
Thank you.
final words you'd like to say to the audience before we log off?
Well, I would just say on that final point that, you know, it has certainly, you can certainly observe that the people pushing for integration today are mostly white people. The Black community leadership is not really pushing for that, even though both survey and empirical data from programs on the ground show that Black and Brown families are very interested in those opportunities when they come up. And I think part of the reason for that is that Black families have concluded correctly that white families aren't going to let these programs happen. And if they do happen, somebody's probably going to call their kid a slur when they get there. And so there's no sense banging their head against the wall trying to get it to happen. And so, like, when we talk about fighting against racism, racism is a white.
Mhm,
So that's the job of people like me
mhm.
to do work on my end of it.
Great point. Thank you for those words of wisdom. Although people take those in consideration moving forward.
Please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Justin Murphy. Yay, go, Mr. Murphy. Thank you so much. And we'll be in touch, of course. And thank you again for being here today. Look
Great.
forward to being in touch. Thanks, everybody. See you next time at the next episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. Have a great day, everybody.